Republicans like Paul Ryan continue to say tariffs aren't the answer. Now, here's my problem with that. They won't tell us what the solution actually is. Break out the whiteboard, Mr. Ryan. Here now to discuss Fox News political contributor Tammy Bruce. She's also Independent Women's Voice president and a Washington Times columnist. Danielle McLaughlin, one of our favorite liberal commentators. And Heather Zumarraga is with us, the Vision 4 Fund Distribution Vice President. Okay, Heather, let me start with you. You're a Wall Street vet. You understand these things. We all understand tariffs or taxes. I think President Trump gets that. I also think he gets that this is the only tool that has never been used against China and other nations that have taken advantage of America for a long time, all while we have watched our prosperity fade.
Yes, most Americans are behind reviving the steel industry as well as pushing back on China's theft of intellectual property. They also have state-owned enterprises. They're a communist country who has subsidized and dumps things like aluminum and steel on the U.S. So President Trump is pushing back. I think most agree with that. The controversy, though, is with the auto tariffs with the EU.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of controversy. Let's face it. A lot of people just simply don't think we should use tariffs. But again, I just keep coming back. All of these brilliant people who tweet, talk, write, and say this, they have yet to tell me what the solution is. By the way, another brilliant fellow jumped in on this debate today, Paul Ryan. Let's take a listen.
I don't support tariffs. I think tariffs are taxes. And I think there are better tools that we can use to hold abusers of trade laws and countries that perpetuate unfair trade practices. I think there are better tools to use to get them to play fairly. So I just don't think the tariff route is the smart way to go.
All right, Tammy, what are those tools? Do you know?
You know, I'll tell you, this is Paul Ryan's known for being the budget guy and the numbers guy. And even when we came up to the tax reform and the tax cuts, he had really no idea what to do. They were all kind of scrambling around. It's never discussed, the details. And the fact is, this is probably, for a man who's a negotiator like President Trump, the best thing to have, because there is some flexibility. You've got the EU commissioner coming over. We've got like a $150 billion surplus when it comes to the trade
deficit with them.
The deficit. Yeah. And these are things that at least we've got to get to some parity. The president talks about simply having some fairness. I don't know if Paul Ryan thinks that us having lost the trade war is okay. This is just something that the president's asking, that we move back into some framework of balance and fairness. He's not saying we want to take advantage of everyone else. He talks about us being the piggy bank. That's true. This is part and parcel of Europe, certainly the European Union, getting to be stronger for themselves, and that's going to help everyone in the long run.
You know, Danielle, we should go back to, we could talk about the source for all of these, but let's say China, for instance. China was able to give us cheap goods because of slave labor, child labor, harsh working conditions, massive subsidies of industries. So we got cheap goods in return. They got our money. Now, the experts tell us what they do with that money is they buy American businesses, whether it's your local nail salon or the Waldorf Astoria. And we should all be thrilled about that. There was a time when Democrats used to push back against the use of child labor and slave labor and unfair trade. But now that Trump likes this, it feels like the Democrats don't.
No, they should be. And one of the big reasons that we have trade agreements is to make sure that we have environmental regulations and labor standards in place. We had that with NAFTA. We had that with TPP. Democrats didn't talk enough about TPP. I know Hillary Clinton was back and forth about it, but
no,
I think
she was against it.
Right. And so the solution for my whiteboard, it's not tariffs. It's a trade agreement like that. You constrain China geopolitically, and you do business with 11 other countries in the area.
So let me educate everyone out there. Our trade agreements, the origins of them with Europe goes back to the GATT, the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, 1948. Not 2018. The EU has changed. It's morphed. The world has changed. Then we went to the World Trade Organization, where you get to self-identify. So China says, we're an emerging nation. We need special benefits like Togo, even though we do $13 trillion a year in business. So, yeah, trade agreements, I think, is what President Trump, Heather, he actually talks about wanting new trade agreements, updated trade agreements where there aren't loopholes and we aren't being ripped off.
Yes, and President Trump isn't alone in reforming the WTO, for example. I believe both the EU and Japan have expressed concern of the current, how the WTO exists right now with Lighthizer, part of the U.S. trade team. So many countries that are in the WTO recognize that it just isn't working when you have China in the WTO since 2001, which their trading practices have gotten worse. If you look at a chart since 2001, our trade imbalance with China and our manufacturers in the U.S. have been hit harder than ever since they've been in the WTO. And there have been many cases filed against China, and it really hasn't changed in terms of their state-owned enterprises and the way they do business. It is not fair and it's not right.
I know it might be boring, but if you ever want to, go to the World Trade Organization and look for yourself, folks. Look at how long and how many times we have filed these same complaints over and over. And the irony is, Tammy, I think Europe has been hit harder than we have. Now they're sort of at the mercy to a degree because their economy is so weak that they have to sell into China, which is a much larger, faster growing economy. And they almost have to accept these things, almost like they have to accept the Iranian trade deal, which also brings me back to the notion when people say, well, you should do this with your allies. You mean the same allies that don't want to tear up the Iranian nuclear deal?
Yeah.
You mean those allies who aren't paying their fair share in NATO? We should somehow all get together and we should wait for France to get tough on China?
And Iran just threatened to close the Hormuz Strait. If there was ever any kind of a problem, then they said that they could then, as a result, would control oil throughout the world. I mean, these are not just rogue regimes, but they're terrorist regimes. We won't talk about karma on this show, but there's some karma attached to this as well. But this is like an intervention, what the president is doing. It's an intervention not just for this country, but clearly for all of our allies. It's maybe you can call it tough love as well, but to have to do business with China, which clearly manipulates its own currency still, dealing with cyber warfare, stealing intellectual property, that we would have to get into bed with the worst actors on the planet is unacceptable. And the president is asking for us to have some fairness amongst ourselves so that we can become independent again.
There was an interesting piece on Axios today, and I think, of course, it was potentially going to be another anti-Trump piece, but to me, it talked about the soft power of China and all the money now they're spending on lobbying. Even the Chinese government, Boehner, for instance. And we've got a lot of folks who are leaving Congress. You wonder what they're going to do for a living. And I hate to see some of these people who are pushing back on this all of a sudden start getting paid by China next year. I hope that's not the case. But they're buying influence, and President Trump talked about that today, Danielle. Should we be wary of this?
Yes, we have to stand up for what American values are. We're not going to forget about Tiananmen Square. We're not going to forget about China's horrendous human rights record. I still believe that constraining them through trade with the EU and trade with the Pacific Rim is the way that we don't hurt our farmers, we don't hurt our meat manufacturers, but we are able to constrain them both economically.
And how do we get them to stop stealing like tens of billions of dollars worth of IP?
That's another
year?
Good question. I think the WTO rules are out of date. The process takes too long, so we need to reform that from within. I think it makes sense to stay within the WTO, but clearly, to Heather's point, they have not been behaving themselves.
And we've got to have a president who they know will act if these things continue.
Yes, who follows through with threats.
President Xi of China is an emperor, and he only respects strength. Thank you all very much, ladies. Fantastic stuff. Meanwhile,